Topic for today is Blue Earth County Wetland Functions and Values Assessment using Rapid Floristic Quality Assessment, presented by Paul Backenstead and Ben Mayer. Paul is an ecologist and project manager at Stantec, who began work in the natural resources field in 1983. He worked at several county and state conservation agencies in both Iowa and Minnesota. He joined Stantec in 1997 and is involved in natural area inventory, planning, and restoration in the upper Midwest. Ben is currently the Metro Wetland Specialist for Minnesota Bowser. Ben has over 20 years of experience with wetland inventory, management, and restoration. Ben was previously employed at Stantec and conducted field inventory and data analysis for the Blue Earth County Wetland Function and Values Assessment with Paul that you're going to see the results of today.
Thanks everyone for the chance to be here today. Can everybody hear me in the back? So I think I'll try and do this without a microphone and we'll see how it goes. We were involved, Ben Meyer and I were involved. The county hired us to do countywide wetlands function and values assessment. The project involved some planning components, the field inventory, and then following the field inventory aspect of it, that information is being used to conduct some countywide planning efforts. And originally we had intended for this to be kind of a two-parted presentation. Part of it was going to be how is the data being used, but that aspect of the project has been set back a little bit, so a decision was made that we were just going to focus on the inventory side of things. Importantly, this project is funded by, or was funded by the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment, which allowed the county to gather some really nice information for this project. So who was involved? From Blue Earth County Environmental Services, Julie Conrad is Land Use and Natural Resources Planner, Scott Salisbury, Land Use Planner and GIS Specialist, and we worked most closely with them during this project. Stacy Fesser, who's here, is a wetland specialist for the county. Tim Grant was also involved in the project, and although he's focused on wells for the most part within the Environmental Services Department. As Allison mentioned, Ben Meyer and myself were involved in this project, and others have provided input, and I apologize if I missed anybody or if talked to anybody that was involved. Mike Burdash, when it came to the Rapid FQA, we worked pretty closely to look at how the calculations were being done, and we communicated quite a bit. And I'll talk a little bit more about some involvement of others with that later. Randy Schindel with the Minnesota DNR, he was in the forestry division. Randy was important in reaching out to some of the private landowners, getting access, including to the property his family owns. And Chris Hughes, whom many of you know through Bowser, who's based out of Mankato, he was involved as well, including his ownership of some property that was inventoried. So today I'd like to talk with you about how wetlands were selected for evaluation, what did we do as part of the evaluation, and how were the wetlands evaluated, and share a few items of interest that might be pertinent to this group, and take you on a little quick photographic tour. So how were wetlands selected for the evaluation? There was quite a bit of work that went in up front, both with the staff and getting input from agency folks on how do we choose a cross-section of wetlands that give us the information that can be used to do county-wide wetland management planning from. So a variety of wetland types were targeted, different landscape settings, a variety of land uses, public and private, commercial, non-commercial, that kind of thing. Wetland condition, and as I mentioned, public and private lands. Activities related specifically to the wetland inventory included background information gathering, collecting as much information as we could about the wetlands and the natural resources of the county itself, as well as the areas that we were charged with inventorying and assessing. Desktop review and MinRAM data entry, the field inventory portion of it, as well as data entry and analysis. The evaluation includes several different standard tools, and I know most of you are familiar with these and have used them quite a bit. The MinRAM methodology, we use version 3.2. We use the hydrology, wildlife, stormwater, recreation, education, and groundwater components of that. And the veg component was pulled out of MinRAM, and it was replaced with the rapid FQA method. The evaluation included MinRAM, which importantly gave the city a systematic means of evaluating the county, a systematic method for evaluating the functions and values. And this was one of the things that we wanted to communicate with the public during an open house, that this was definitely a well-accepted methodology, and it had a lot of background behind it and a lot of support. It gave a means of comparing wetlands across a broad geographic area, means of comparing the condition and functionality of a particular wetland over time. One of the things that's really interesting to me, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the geologic history of the Minnesota River Valley, but the whole geologic history of the glacial river warren, the ebbing of the last glaciation is key in creating the landform of Blue Earth County. So when glacial river warren emptied out Lake Agassiz, actually before that even, there's some speculation that this is a really unnatural bend in the Minnesota River here. There's some speculation that at some point in the end of the last glacial period that this may have actually been a type of drainage down to the Des Moines River Valley, and then eventually got cut off. And you can see a couple moraines here, like the Altamont and Bemis moraines in Iowa. And eventually, when glacial Lake Agassiz emptied, it ran into this area and it took that sharp 90-degree corner. But there was a lot of down cutting in the Minnesota River, and it created nick points and rapids and that type of thing, and a lot of the tributaries that emanate in particular to the south in Blue Earth County. So you end up with these often steep-sided, incised stream valleys, and they have a lot of seeps and things associated with them. And then further to the south in the till plains, you end up with a lot of depressional wetlands. So the geology provides, plus all the floodplains associated with the Minnesota River Valley itself, and then the tributaries, provides for some really interesting wetlands in the county. So depressional prairie potholes, seepage meadows, in particular associated with like the Blue River and Watonwan River valleys. There's a lot of discharge at various points on slopes and right in the floodplains. And there are places to the south where there's seepage discharge on the till plain as well. Side slope swales, stream and river, lake margin. So there's some nice lakes, particularly in the northeast part of the state. Northeast part of the county, wet meadow and wet prairie. And watersheds in Blue Earth County support a wide variety of plant species that are uncommon or rare for Minnesota. And a lot of these have influence more from the south. There's an influence from the southwest as well as from the southeast as far as different guilds of plants. So some of the plants that are present in wetland and wetland edges in Blue Earth County are tuberous Indian plantain that's state threatened, green dragon, which is in the genus that Jack in the Pulpit is in. And I ran into this, not in Blue Earth County, although it should be found in some of the river valleys in Blue Earth County. I ran into it in both Faribault and Watonwan counties in a couple of years previous to this effort. So it should be there. And it's mostly found in floodplain, floodplain terrace forests, formerly known as lowland hardwood forests. Rattlesnake master, Sullivan's milkweed, and I'm familiar with that one from further south as well. It's fairly common in saturated wet prairies, in particular those that are pastured. Small white lady slipper, world nut rush, and marsh arrowgrass, plus others. So as I mentioned before, I won't go into MinRAM because all of you guys have used MinRAM before, I'm sure, and at times probably too much. The rapid floristic quality assessment method is, as I mentioned, substituted for the vegetation component of MinRAM. So I'll kind of walk through a little bit of the methodology for that, because although you may have heard about it, this, as I understand it, was kind of the first large project, countywide project that this was used in Minnesota. So to begin with, and this follows the methodology that's laid out in the manual that Mike Burdash, who's here with others, put together. The first step is to map or sketch boundaries of what's referred to as the assessment area, basically the wetland you're going to look at, and then map within that individual plant communities. So the photo on the left here shows basically an assessment area outline, and then the photo on the right here shows it broken out more into the plant community boundaries. And that's done remotely first and then rectified after the field work is done. With rapid FQA, the reason it is rapid, and Michael or others who are intimately involved with this, if I'm misspeaking, let me know. Part of the reason it's rapid is it uses a set collection of species that are known to occur in wetlands throughout the state that provide indicator abilities for wetlands. So basically a two-sided or two-sheeted plant species list is provided. For each plant community that's identified within an assessment area, a set meander time is used to do a meander survey within each one of those. So the first plant community is 30 minutes, and every community after that, 20 minutes is added. And the nice thing about this, and one of the reasons I'll talk more about this later that I like this, is that it's not just a checklist of presence-absence, but it records the different categories of cover, the relative occurrence of the different plant species, which I think is really important. So all the wetland areas were sampled by just straightforward meander survey. Anything that's shallower than a deep marsh or a shallow marsh, excuse me. The shoreline areas on the edge of the lakes are sampled a little bit differently. For those areas, you wade in and you actually use this sampling tool that's better known as a garden claw with a rope tied to it. I think it's 20 feet. You walk into an area and you cast out 3 times, pull it back, and then whatever you sample is part of your plant list. So this particular photo here is one that Ben Meyer took of me baking my brains out on an August day in a lake edge, a lake margin lily pad area using that methodology. One of the really nice things about using the rapid FQA method here in Minnesota is that the MPCA put together a really nice calculator spreadsheet that makes it super simple to use this. So it's, for the most part, it's a plug-and-play system. You gather your information in the field, you go back to the office, you plug in the plant species, or you could even do it in the field if you have the right tools to do that with. And using coefficients of conservatism, it spits out calculations for it that you can use for other things in the wetlands. So just a really quick note about coefficients of conservatism. If you're not familiar with them, they're widely used in other states. It's something that was developed in the Chicago region by Swank and Wilhelm many years ago. It's being adopted in many places around the country. Iowa uses it pretty widely. Wisconsin uses it very widely, and they'll even use it for monitoring of restoration areas and mitigation areas. Illinois uses it as well. We've been a little bit slower to adopt it here in Minnesota, and it's been primarily with wetland areas. And the coefficient of conservatism, the number basically runs from 0 through 10, 0 being non-native, and 1 being a very ruderal species, and 10 being a plant species that's associated with a plant community of high quality or has special characteristics or is endangered. So once the rapid FQA calculations are done, then that has to be converted into biological condition gradient score. And a tier system was developed as part of the process here in Minnesota to do this rapid FQA. And essentially, there are 5 different tiers, and it goes from tier 1 to 5, and the tier 1 is the one that's most like pre-settlement vegetation, the highest quality, and 5 is the lowest quality. I really like the rapid FQA methodology. I understand the value of the traditional FQA system that was set up in Chicago and is adopted by most states. One of my concerns has always been that there's no way to take into account the frequency of occurrence of a particular plant species within an area that's to be monitored or sampled. And I think from my perspective, one of the real big benefits for using this rapid FQA method is that it does use that weighting of species by cover. And I think it really has the potential to be used more widely in Minnesota for monitoring of restoration sites as well as monitoring of other areas too. And I think there's a potential for it to be expanded just not for wetlands but beyond that to other areas. So this is actually one of the rapid FQA scores that got kicked out with the DCG tier level for, it was actually wetland number 5, and it had 2 different plant communities. So basically I just wanted to show you that these 2 tiers, the weighted score is based on the percentage of what plant communities occur within a particular wetland. Again, the spreadsheet's great for this. You plug the data in and it does proportional calculations for you. It automatically gives you a tier level, which then feeds back into your min-ram veg score, which is really, really nice. And I think above and beyond the traditional min-ram veg part, I think this gives a more accurate picture of the quality and the potential for management protection within wetlands. We did not do, Stantec did not do any data analysis, so to speak, for this project. We basically did the min-ram and the rapid FQA, but we didn't go on beyond that. So I really don't have a whole lot to share in terms of the analysis of the data. But what I did do is I spent just a little bit of time to try and give a little bit of a picture of some of the different plant community types that are found in wetlands in areas of the inventory. And by far, within Blue Earth County, the most numerous wetlands were shallow marsh. And as you might suspect in a highly agricultural landscape, there was a lot of narrowleaf cattail, hybrid cattail, and that kind of thing. The next one was fresh wet meadow, and as you might suspect, again, in a highly agricultural landscape with lots of nutrient sediment runoff from adjacent farm fields. A lot of these turned out to be reed canary grass monotypes. But there were some other, some pretty nice wetlands there in different areas. The deep marshes were generally associated with lakes. Floodplain forest we looked at along the Blue Earth and Watonwan rivers primarily, but also along the Minnesota River. Very little shrub car that we saw, and that included a combination of sandbar willow as well as some wetlands that had additional willows and red osier dogwood. And then there were several wet to wet mesic prairies that we looked at too, and I'll talk a little bit more about these. So in terms of the breakdown, the assessment areas, we looked at quite a few different wetlands, and by far, again, I think this is an indicator of the agricultural character of the landscape. Most of them were lower, medium, and then high and exceptional were really just about 10 to 11% of the entire study. The condition of the function and function of wetlands varies, mostly related to past land use in Blue Earth County. The alterations to vegetation and hydrology were common, especially for depressional wetlands, primarily occurring in the till plains in the southern part of the county. The side slope swales, and those were impacted quite a lot by downcutting of streams as well as other activities. And then stream and river wetlands, my take on the stream and river wetland impacts were in part due to the hydrologic changes in some of the tributaries as well as the Minnesota River Basin. There were quite a few restored wetlands that were part of the overall assessment project, and their overall condition as restorations varied quite a bit on the condition of the wetland at the time of the restoration. There were a number of wetlands that we went and looked at that were agency purchases, and they impounded swales or removed drainage features, and so in a lot of cases they were starting from scratch from ag land. Less frequently the restorations were pre-existing, like pasture land with native vegetation, and there was a lot more of the restoration of hydrology above and beyond the historic water levels. As I mentioned before, I really like the Rapid FQA because it provides additional detail and accuracy. I think for Blue Earth County it's going to be a really nice tool for tracking the longitudinal condition of wetlands, particularly those that are restored and agency owned. The sensitivity is partly based on the coincidence of the rapid list, as we talked about. And one of the things that both Bev and I did in the field is we gathered complete species lists. So even though we had the 2-page rapid list, we pretty much went through and wrote down every species that we could identify, and bagged and tagged everything that we couldn't identify in the field and tried to get a positive ID on it. And my hope is that even though that doesn't factor into the Rapid FQA methodology calculations, that if somebody looks at that at some point in the future, and they'll be able to tell something new came in or this went away. But just a quick photographic tour with a few comments. As I mentioned, there's a lot of this going on in the county, a lot of hybrid and narrow-leaf cattails in these broad, shallow basins. Many of them are people attempted to drain, they've got ditches going through them, or tile systems adjacent to them, or even sometimes through them. Mixed emergent marsh, these vary quite a lot across the county. So this is actually the edge of a lake, the edge of a lake, and it's a lake with an outlet, so there is some fluctuation of the water. This particular one is offline from a river system and had pretty decent vegetation, and you can see that it's seasonally dry. This was done in August. As I mentioned too, some of the restored wetlands, this is actually a Minnesota DNR wildlife management area. And at first when I started walking into it, I couldn't tell on the far end that they had burned this up and put a control structure in, because the vegetation was actually pretty decent. It wasn't until I got down to the far end that I realized that that there was quite a lot of hydrologic change. They actually they impounded a swale, and they actually threw the water level up like a foot or a foot and a half higher than it would have historically been. But the native vegetation responded pretty well. There was native vegetation all the way across this. The only place there was a lot of non-native vegetation was along the edge. There was a fair amount of reed canary grass there. The Watonwan and Blue Earth River valleys, periodically there were seepage meadows, and a lot of them had peat, which was really interesting to see. So, and some of these ran, it was kind of interesting, some of these kind of ran in a sinuous fashion adjacent to the river, and then eventually were more connected hydrologically to the river. This is where we saw, I think, the highest species richness was in these areas. This is private property. This is Randy Schindel of the Minnesota DNR, and that's actually a seepage meadow on his family property that's immediately adjacent to a restored wetland that was impounded. And this is actually a seep. There were several seeps that we looked at that were side hill seeps, and one of the things that is fairly common in Blue Earth County is they occurred a lot in pastures, and the grazing animals would get in there and impact the sides of it, so there was a fair amount of erosion, on top of the fact that some of these had, where they occurred, there was a lot of runoff from the slopes above them. So we saw a lot of caving of the ground around the seepage areas, and it was actually working its way uphill in a number of areas. So the quality of the vegetation in those varied quite a lot depending upon how much disturbance there was from hillside subsidences and impacts from grazing animals. As I mentioned, deep marsh and lake margins, we looked at a number of those primarily in the northeast part of the county, and those were actually in pretty good condition. We really didn't run into any invasive species in the submergent zone, which was really nice to see because that's such a big problem elsewhere in the state. Wet meadow, as I mentioned before, it was pretty common to have reed canary grass transitioning right into narrowleaf and hybrid cattail, but there were some areas where it was primarily natives, and this occurred sometimes adjacent to lakes and sometimes adjacent to deeper marshes. It was nice to see every once in a while we'd run into something nice. This was a nice population of northern bog orchid that we ran into at one site. River and stream wetlands, these varied quite a lot too. It was interesting that where the Watonwan meets the Blue Earth River, there's a relatively broad area. And as I understand it, the hydrology in that area is such that with the frequent flooding and the more frequent flooding and the more severe flooding, this has changed a fair amount. But that was largely devoid of vegetation in these areas, even though these are offline from the river themselves. This is a big open water wetland area. There's really very little vegetation in there. There were a number of backwater chutes that were connected periodically to the river. You could tell they get flooded once in a while, and those tended to be less diverse than some other areas. Like this one is at the lower end of the Watonwan, upstream from where it meets the next river. And it was really interesting. You could tell that it didn't get disturbed nearly as much from frequent flooding or severe flooding. It had a really nice assemblage of plants. There was a lot of water parsnip there, and that's what the white is, the Seam suave. The restored wetlands, as I mentioned, there was huge amount of variation in the quality. A lot of the restored wetlands ended up having the water levels increased above what the historic level would have been, in particular those areas that were purchased by the state and federal wildlife agencies. So we saw a lot of plumbing, a lot of notched weir structures with stop logs, and these tended to be, for the most part, pretty low quality and low diversity. In a number of instances, what happened is there was a depressional wetland that had pre-existing narrowleaf and hybrid cattail across the entire bottom of it, and they went down at the lower end. Like, this is a Fish and Wildlife Service waterfowl production area. They threw a low-head berm up on the downhill side and put in a water control structure and essentially just floated all the cattails off of the bottom in there. So there's a cattail mat about this high off the substrate that's about that thick. A lot of fun to walk through. We ran into a number of farmed wetlands, no surprise, and a number of these, if they had permanent vegetation, they often had plumbing underneath them and a lot of reed canary grass, but the county wanted to get a couple of those into the mix so we could understand those. There was one that Ben met the landowner for and assessed. It was quite interesting. There was actually pretty decent vegetation in this wetland. It was out in the middle of a field, and he essentially ran a Senate bit of irrigation all the way around this thing, so this always had hydrology because it got irrigated pretty much every day during the summer. But for whatever reason, it didn't seem to have harmed the vegetation too poorly. There were a number of lakeside depressional wetlands that were behind ice ridges, little natural berms on the lake edges. So there were a number of depressions. Some of these actually were tiled and drained, but others were in a little bit better shape. And I don't think I have a picture of one that was in good shape in there. There are a number of wet prairies, including one in Judson Township. This particular one, Chris Hughes from Bowser owns, and it has a fair number of rare species on it. It has some depressional wetlands, wet prairie. This is on a terrace in the Minnesota River, which is really interesting because in a lot of cases the bedrock is only a foot or so below the surface of the soil. At times the water table is perched right up on top of the soil, and often later in the summer it gets really dry. This is an area where the tuberous Indian plantain is, and he has showy lady, or excuse me, small white lady slipper on his property as well. I don't know where we're at time-wise. I guess that's only half an hour. Again, I appreciate the chance to be here. That's a really 30,000-foot run through the project. I hope you got a little bit out of it. If you have any questions, let me know. Ben's in the back. He'll answer all of them. Yeah.
In terms of the vegetation quality, when you incorporated it into the program, since you have 5 tiers in the rapid FQA, how did you bring that into the
Yeah, there's a crosswalk in there. I can't remember the exact way it gets crosswalked, but there's a smooth crosswalk and it's standardized.
Okay.
And it's in, I believe it's in the rapid FQA methodology. Michael, do you remember right offhand?
Sorry, I was a little distracted.
How do the tiers get crosswalked into MinRAM for
Into
quality?
MinRAM?
The five tiers versus in the
It's actually, with the rapid FQA, we're just dealing with the top 4 tiers. And they definition-wise, they really match up well with how they're described in MinRAM.
So,
If you look at the rapid FQA manual, there's an appendix in the back that specifically addresses adapting this for the veg part of MinRAM, and it kind of discusses that and lays that out. That 5th tier or bottom tier is more kind of theoretical. It's like the devoid or deficient kind of quality. That would be like a farm wetland where the disturbance is literally so severe and frequent that there isn't any hydrophytic vegetation at all. And so you don't necessarily, at least at this point, need a rapid FQA to some hard measurements to show that you're in kind of that level. You just got to make a judgment call if they're saying it's a pretty bad shape. Thank you.
yeah.
In your criteria or your category of rivers and streams, how did you further split those out? What kind of criteria did you use to, there's ditches all over Blue Earth County, there's intermittent streams and so on and so forth. How did you categorize the different, how many categories did you come up with?
Well, the riverine, I think we primarily looked at, was it in the floodplain or if it wasn't in the floodplain, does it get affected by the flooding? Ben, do you have any additional comments on that?
No, that sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say we looked at natural systems. It wouldn't have been a created ditch or something if that's what.
Yeah,
you're
the wetlands selected were primarily associated with, say, backwater chutes or backwater shallow marshes associated with like the Minnesota River, or there were a couple of instances like with the Blue Earth River where there was an abandoned meander, like an oxbow. That a couple of those that we went in and looked at. Curiously enough, and this was something interesting that played into the past land use and management of these areas. There was one area that I went to with Randy Schindel that he knew. I think his family owns some adjacent land, and he knew the landowners. And one of the backwater oxbows that periodically floods, the people who own that had historically, and I'm sure this predates WACA, put in dikes on periodically along it to try and manage the water for duck hunting.
Can you explain what you mean when you refer to the longitudinal condition of wetlands?
Oh, to kind of follow them over time, really. And I think it would primarily relate to restored wetlands or wetlands that have the potential to change over time. So like restoration on a Fish and Wildlife Service waterfowl production area. When the hydrology is first restored, or in some instances there were some seasonally flooded areas that they seeded right across the bottom with a wet seed mix. To be able to go back over time and kind of track, well, sure, that was a hybrid and early cattail dominated system when the hydrology was first restored. If we come back and monitor it in 10 years or 20 years, has anything changed? So that's really what I meant, is just kind of follow the fate of things over time. And in particular, I think that's where I think the rapid FQA system can really be helpful to monitor restorations over time, not just for wetlands, for the vegetation.
How did you select the wetlands that you used to do that?
Actually, the county selected those, and I don't know if I can put Stacy on the spot.
I
She's
didn't
here
really
today.
hear the whole question.
How did you select the wetlands?
We had a few meetings with some technical people in the area, people that knew the wetlands that we were familiar with. We had, riverine wetlands we wanted to look at. We had kind of our list of ones we wanted to hit. And then we looked at public ones, if they were in public. Obviously, we didn't have to get permission on those, so those, we tried to get as much of those as we could. And then the ones that were on private ones were ones that we were familiar with, or ones that people that we had come to our meeting were familiar with. We had consultants and people from the DNR, and just we kind of created a technical committee that was familiar with wetlands. So we chose them based on that. So we had like 100 selected, and then after we went through and got permission from people, that's really brought our list down, and we got 75 total.
And I'll mention too that they worked really hard and they did a really nice job of reaching out to landowners and coordinating with agency staff and internally at Environmental Services in Blue Earth County. And even when the field portion of the project started, I think the number of wetlands, we inventoried assessed 75 wetlands across the county. And I think even at the time that we started looking, like a few weeks before the field work was to start, I think it was still in the 80-something range. And there were some fallbacks. Okay, this landowner hasn't gotten back to me. This one did. This one fits in with the model of what we want to have in the cross-section of wetlands for a wetland management evaluation. So the county staff did a huge effort. And I'll say too, and I forgot to mention this during the presentation, Julie, Conrad, Scott Salisbury, Stacy, they worked really hard to include the public. There was a really nice open house for the landowners. So we met with a lot of the landowners when we went out in the field and had questions. And a lot of the landowners who we met in the field even came to the open house, and everybody wanted to know what, not just what did you do, but what's unique about my property, what's special, and what can we do to help perpetuate the quality of it, which was really impressive.
We really tried to make the people that wanted to, volunteer their land to be looked at, to feel like we weren't just using them, that we were, they were very interested in the wetlands on their property, so they were excited to hear about the information at the land committee, and we had a really good turnout for our meeting. Most of the people actually showed up and asked great questions.
Yeah, and actually, Julie and Scott, you might have been involved in this too, Stacy. They put together mini reports for each landowner that's customized to their property. They had a site map, a summary of the findings and then notes about any unique features.
And all the pictures and things.
Yep, photos. It really made landowners feel special and like they had something to take care of. Yep.
What kind of recommendations do you see coming forth from the report to the county as far as how are they going to move forward with this information? And what does it mean to wetland delineators?
Oh boy, I might have to look at Stacy in this one too, because we primarily just did the wetland image, the wetland assessment work. We didn't even get into the deep analysis of the data.
Right, this was just, as a county, we're looking at using this, we're creating a wetland management plan from this data. So we will be using this, it's one of the criteria that you have to do when you're moving forward with the management plan. So this is just one small step in the bigger, scale of things that we'll be doing, but we'll be taking this data and using it to kind of create a management plan for the county, because eventually we want to, the management plan will direct the ordinance, and we will kind of protect or restore in certain areas based on kind of how they fall. So this will get incorporated into like a model, and then every wetland that gets looked at from when we incorporate our ordinance or whatever will kind of be evaluated based on this model that gets created, and then put into kind of a management category, and then from that, how do we want to protect it or restore it or impact it?
Thanks, Stacy. Yeah, Rob.
These flooded cattail marshes that you mentioned that had the burns on them, and the cattail mat would float up.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea if those persist over time, or they break up, and you get more interspersion of open water over time?
Well, that's a good question, and I think this group in general probably have a little bit more experience with that than I do, but the few examples I saw where they'd been flooded for anywhere between 2 and 5 years, and similar experiences in the past, it takes a long time for that to break up, and they'll just float around and go back and forth. It was that one wetland that I showed you that had the thick floating mat. I actually went back there duck hunting in the fall, and it was just miserable to walk through. So, and that one had been flooded for at least 3 years, so there was a lot of decomposition, but the cattails just seemed to float around a lot. So I don't know how long it would take to break that up and change the character of the, absent maybe a drawdown and a burn. I don't know how long it would take to change that.
You showed the percentages of the distribution of the different wetland types that you looked at.
Yeah.
And so shrub carr, for instance, was 2.5% or something like that, so 1 or 2 sites.
Yeah.
Is that reflective of what's on the ground? So for instance, are approximately 25% of the wetlands in the county fresh wet meadow?
That's a good question. I don't know that the county compared that. The question, Stacy, was the proportions that are shown in this table, is this relatively reflective of what's going on in the county overall? And I don't know that anybody looked at it. I think the intent was to try and approximate in terms of what got assessed.
Right, we tried to just kind of get a broad spectrum of, okay, we have all these types, we want to try to at least hit every type that we look at. We didn't evaluate the data to see if it, or compare it to what's actually out there. Total, that will probably be on our list of things that we still would like to do.
It would be interesting to look at. Yeah, Jason.
The question I have is got to do with cost benefit. So you could just do the MinRam vegetation,
Yeah.
or you could do a rapid FQA, or you could do a full FQA.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a lot of wetlands that you looked at, so you have
Yeah.
a lot of experience here. And what was your feeling on? Were you getting different answers than what you would have gotten using MinRam veg versus rapid FQA? And
Oh, yeah.
do you feel like you were getting better information from using a rapid FQA than the MinRam?
Yeah, we didn't compare, so we didn't run the veg portion of MinRam, run the rapid FQA, and then do a full FQA. So I can't, other than just to speculate, I can't say too much. As a plant guy, my inclination is always to gather as much information as I can about plant species, because I think it's an important part of the story. But you know, I think my sense is that the rapid FQA gave really good information, and probably better, at least more concrete, I think, data about the quality of the vegetation. You know, in the end, I think my personal preference, again, as a plant guy, probably would have been to run an FQA with the setup that Michael's put together, but use the full list with all the coefficients of conservatism. And again, I really like, and that was, I know when, and I should point out too that Michael, Scott Milburn, and Jason and some other people were really involved in putting a lot of this together in over the past, I don't know, 6 or 8 years for the coefficients of conservatism and the rapid FQA, and they did a great job. But and I know that the question during that discussion when rapid FQA was getting tested in the field for 2 seasons was sort of how much, you know, what level of effort is appropriate to get a decent amount of information on the back end to do planning and evaluation with. And I think for most instances, my sense is the rapid FQA would work fine. But I guess I would suggest that if you're looking at like a wetland mitigation site, and you can get a person out there that has a reasonable knowledge about the plant species, that it'd be worthwhile to just get all the plant species into the spreadsheet and get it calculated that way. Especially because of the cover class codes and frequency of occurrence thing. I think that'd be so valuable.
On the other side of the cost benefit, what was your budget on this to complete this assessment?
Boy, I don't remember right offhand. It's been 2 years. This was, that's part of the reason for my fogginess about some of this stuff, because we did this in the summer of 2013. I'm thinking it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 43,000.
That's what I would say,
Yeah, and that included, you know, all the background information, all the data entry, all the field work over the course of several months, and then the 2 public meetings, including the one open house with the landowners.
You had the one slide that indicated a lot of the wetlands had moderate value or medium value. And if you're talking about a lot of wetlands that have been disturbed, why go through all the bother just to come up with an M at the very end? I mean, you know, you want to use this for nice sites or restoration sites, but a lot of the common run-of-the-mill, the MinRam's going to give you an M or an L. You know, why bother doing this?
Good question.
I think that question's beyond my pay grade.
Just a thought.
Yeah, it's definitely a good question to ask. Yeah. Good question.
I was wondering if you identified any excellent potential areas for restoration for bank sites.
I think most of the sites, I don't recall any restoration sites right offhand. Most of the sites we looked at had been restored. And again, a lot of the historic hydrology and what it was restored to very wide, really widely. Thinking of one U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service site over by Lake Crystal, they threw like a 10-foot berm up on that thing and flooded a whole valley, and it was primarily waterfowl habitat. And that was one of the sites that we looked at. Actually, there were 2 of them on that particular WPA we looked at. But no, I don't know that an effort was made to find non-restored or restorable sites.
Not for this part. We just wanted to look at the what. That'll be.
That would be an interesting before and after. I think that'd be a great way to use rapid FQA. Well, I guess if nobody else has any more questions, I'll say thank you. And we came close to an hour, so I hope they still give you the credit. You suffered through 55 minutes, yeah, I give it to you anyway.
We got more cookies and coffee back here, if people want to hang out, talk. Certainly welcome.